psychology profession, within psychology, within psychiatry, within medicine. And we were thinking very little's really going on in the systemic field, in the systemic social constructionist communities. Back then, we're looking back several years now, and I've written a couple of things. You've been working in the field, Fran Augustin, but joined a special interest group where we organize is it a biannual? It's a biannual conference on autism and systemic practice. And that's been really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's been interesting, what would you say has made it an interesting conference that's turned things around for us politically?
I think it's changed and developed the conference. I think the first conference, as much as we challenged the narrative that it was about autism and we were trying to take an inclusive approach, I think that the relationship around autism and neurodiversity and lived experience has really changed as the conference has continued. When we were first in the conversations, it was largely therapists talking about work with autistic people, wasn't it? Whereas I think some of the movement now is autistic therapists talking about being an autistic therapist working with autistic people. I think there's been a real shift, hasn't there?
I think you're right. And I think the first concession we made in the first conference was that we had a guest speaker who was autistic and their parent, and we had a breakout room. And honestly, I think that was the extent of things. And now we have consistently guest speakers who are our keynote speakers who are autistic. A lot of the presenters are autistic and therapists, or therapists, and we've created our own conference practice. So although we need to introduce ourselves, I'll just say one more thing, because I remember just before the autism conference we had this last summer, going to another conference where, out of respect for the speakers, the chairperson said, "Will everybody please keep their cameras on during the presentations?" And we begin our conference by saying, feel free to have your camera on, off, put your feet up, do whatever you need to do to make yourself comfortable. And we've kind of arrived at the idea that good autism practice, meaning neurodiverse sensitive, is just good practice, good people practice. So that's an invitation to everybody here this evening. If you want to look into the camera, if you want to be seen, fine. If you don't want to, do whatever you need to do to put yourself at ease and enable yourself to participate in whatever way you need to participate. Mary, let's introduce ourselves. And can we ask other people to mute themselves while we're talking? There's some background noise going on.
Yeah, could everyone please mute your microphones? Yeah. Thank you.
Mary, who are you? Why are you here?
I ask myself that question every morning. So yeah, my name's Mairi Evans. I'm a systemic psychotherapist and social worker by background. I'm currently working the National Health Service in the UK in Berkshire Healthcare. I'm working in a number of different roles, and I work with a number of different projects, really. Neurodiversity is quite strongly part of that. I'm a clinical director, and part of my directorate includes the autism and ADHD services for both adults and children. I'm also the Trust Neurodiversity Lead, so I'm leading on the development of a neurodiversity strategy for the Trust. It's an all-encompassing strategy that's about improving the experience of our neurodivergent patients, but also our neurodivergent workforce, and encouraging neurodivergent people to feel supported when they have healthcare, but also when they provide healthcare. I'm the parent to 2 neurodivergent children. I'm neurodivergent myself. I think think there's one neurotypical person in our family. So neurodiversity is very much a thread within our everyday life, really. But I'm also working on a number of different projects with NHS England and the local health service, where we're looking at approaching autism diagnosis and autism services differently. One of those things is leading on a needs-led support work stream. And that's very much about changing narratives about how people access support when they identify as neurodivergent, as autistic, or having ADHD, and how we can do things differently. So Gail, how about you?
I'm a systemic social constructionist therapist, and I live in Yorkshire, and I've been interested in the construction of autism and the use of the language around autism and neurodiversity for quite a while, since my cousin was born before the language of autism being used. And so my family was affected. And I'm interested in the politics of anything related to health services and how things get constructed as, for example, a mental health diagnosis or not. I think it's a matter of time before, like other things like that, in quotes, homosexuality. And I think it's a matter of time before autism comes out of the DSM and the ICD and something else is left behind in there, i.e. that it's not a mental health condition. So I'm interested in the politics, I suppose, around a number of issues that come under the umbrella of mental health, whether it's queerness and or autism or transgender lives. And the other thing is that maybe to mention is that I'm really interested in intersectionality, because so many people go missing at the margins or at the intersections. Like your research into mothers of daughters with autism, and girls have gone missing from support services, not having had their needs acknowledged. So our last but one conference was on autism and intersectionality, where we heard from people around Blackness and autism, around gender and autism, transgender and autism, people speaking from within their own experiences, autistic people or parents or friends or colleagues. And so I think my interest, our shared interest is in sense making, and yours in particular, resourcing in collaboration with the communities that are being served. But Mary, let's just jump a little bit. Let's just talk about the language. What would you say has happened in the language around autism over time? Because people are often not sure what words to use anymore.
No, and I think as soon as you use the term, it gets changed, doesn't it? So neurodiversity is used, but the term neurodiversity is meant to refer to everybody, because we are all neurodiverse. And then you hear terms like neurodivergent, so diverting from the norm. But what's the norm anyway? And who identifies the norm? Who has the power to define what's the norm and what's not the norm? And then people adopt terms like neurospicy and neurovariant, and there's so many different terms, isn't there? And then we had Asperger's that was in DSM-4 at the time, when I think Sadler talked about the diagnostic manuals being kind of governed by different themes, and DSM-4 was very much about splitting. So things were split into different kind of subcategories, so that you had Asperger's and autism, whereas now you've got what was defined as lumpers, so it's all put together again under one heading. And for me, it's about who starts to define what's in and what's out. I think, like you were saying about homosexuality, you know, that was, I think, was it 1972? It was removed. I can't remember, but the the kind of changing, and who has the power to define that. And with autism being in the diagnostic manuals, then does that take away someone's right to self-identify in a way that can be seen as valid because they've not been seen by a medical professional, and it's the medical professionals that work with the diagnostic criteria? So are you autistic if you don't have an autism diagnosis? Do you become autistic when you get the diagnosis? Were you not autistic before? Is it the diagnosis that makes you autistic and the professional that makes you autistic, or is it your lived experience that defines you?
Just before we joined the group, you mentioned something really interesting about peer certification. Can you say something about that? Because that's kind of quite a radical intervention.
Yeah, I really liked it. I was talking to a lady today who leads or co-leads an autistic-led autism charity, and they run groups that are either for people who have been diagnosed or recently self-identified. So they open their doors either way. And one of the things they do is they provide people with a certificate that's a peer-supported certificate of identification as being autistic. So it's something that someone can have and hold, where they can feel people have heard them and they validated their experience, but without going through a medical, assessment and diagnosis.
Well, there's something about the medicalization of, by the way, people, if you have any points you want to raise and add into the conversation, or any questions or things you want us to pick up on, please pop them in the chat and we'll keep an eye on that and come back to it. But something about the medicalization of lived experience that sometimes authorizes, and people find it so helpful to be told, yeah, there really is something that is a struggle for you, and it comes under this umbrella. But then, yes, what happens when people have to wait 2 years for a diagnosis or more, and then at the end of it don't really get offered anything? So then it becomes a self-help thing, or join a community. Just jumping back though to language, because language is never innocent, and that's one of the fundamental lessons of social construction, is that all these terminologies came about in a particular era for a particular purpose, perhaps, usually imbued with power relations or in the context of power relations, i.e., somebody made these terms up, perhaps for very good reasons. So although Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger were working in the 20s and 30s and 40s, it was only Lorna Wing that brought particularly Asperger to light in, was it early 83, something like that?
Yeah. So, I mean, sorry, go.
Well, I was just thinking, these things are very tricky, because it turns out, as some of you might know, that although a lot of people are really attached to the term Asperger syndrome, they have Asperger syndrome, which might equate to some version of high functioning autism. In fact, Hans Asperger handed over his files to the Nazis, and in order for his patients to be exterminated. I don't know if any of you knew that. I want to sort of give a kind of health warning, shock warning in front of these kind of things, but it's part of history that there are these lovely photos of him looking warm and engaged with a young child, wearing a white coat. But he subscribed to the eugenics idea that perhaps they weren't going to live a normal, fulfilled life, that they couldn't contribute to society. And so those patients, those people, were carted off to concentration camps and murdered. Psychoanalytic practitioners in the 80s, oh, I shouldn't put them all in one breath, that sounds really terrible. Okay, pause, new paragraph, hit the return button. The psychoanalytic practitioners in the 80s, before Lorna Wing's work, I think, was out, they were very interested in something that was called infantile psychosis. where they were trying to understand how autism started and in children who were not connecting, not making social relations as easily as very young babies, would stare at lights a long time and so on. This also coincided with some terrible theory around refrigerator mothers, that the mother hadn't made, this was the theory, great theory, I'm being sarcastic, that the mother hadn't made enough of a connection with the baby, that the parents had problems. So often the female parents were blamed for a child's difficulty connecting and being able to bring forth a social relation, an active interaction with their child. So some of these theories, you know, our profession has a lot to answer for. People have tried to be kind and inventive and understand, but often it's been quite persecuting.
Yeah. And I mean, the lived experience of that for people can be even now. So I'm talking to one young person, young adult now, but when they received their diagnosis, their parents were told that they were never going to have a relationship, they were never going to work, they were never going to live independently. They now have their own flat, they have a partner, they're working in quite a senior position, you know. So the kind of negative sort of narratives that can sometimes be bestowed upon people when a diagnosis is made alongside the diagnosis, it's almost like, well, your future is now written and this is what your ability will be or won't be. And you mentioned high functioning, Gail, and that's another term that sits uncomfortably, I think, with a lot of people. So if you think about, Piers was saying every naming is a not naming, isn't it? So if you're naming a group of people high functioning, are you naming another group of people as low functioning? What does it mean to be low functioning? Because does that mean somehow that feels less valued? High functioning sounds like a positive, and low functioning sounds like a negative, when actually people have different levels of support needs, and people have different areas and things that they shine at in different places and at different times.
Precisely, because it's a bit of a curiosity killer. Ah, you're this rather than that. And then there's a sort of full stop at the end of it, as opposed to how are you? What's your experience in the world? There's something about diagnoses that, while useful and reassuring, and sometimes a gateway to some resourcing, can also kill our curiosity and stop us from meeting the person, getting to know the person. I remember when I was working in a child and family consultation center, I often found myself symptom spotting. I was joining with the dominant discourse and thinking, are they, aren't they? Are they, aren't they? And that goes on a lot now. They're a little bit autistic. They appear to be autistic, whatever it is. And that, I think, can be useful to a degree, but it can also distract us. It can distract us from meeting the person and finding out who they are. And I think, Mary, it's you who says, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person.
Yeah, it's not me, I've pinched it, but
Oh,
it's
right,
definitely.
okay, well, I quote you.
I think for me as well, though, the one of the things that I've had to kind of work with and almost come to terms with is my relationship with social constructionism and social constructionist thinking, and with autism and autism diagnosis, because I really felt that to be a good social constructionist, if there's such a thing, you know, there was that real challenge about autism diagnosis and diagnosis as a negative thing. But then lived experience has been of diagnosis also being very positive and very useful for a lot of people. It's helped them identify and explain who they are, work out where they are in the world, you know, find their tribe and balance those things. So for me, it's been very much about how do you take that both and position, where you are very much curious about diagnosis of, in particular around autism, and its history and the meanings around it, the power, the control, whilst at the same time being respectful to people's lived experience and not denying their lived experience as someone diagnosed as autistic as well. And it's that kind of balance, isn't it, really? But how do you do that both and, I think, in the world that we inhabit as practitioners and social constructionists?
But the world is quite divided still between doctors and members of the public. Now, that's not to say doctors can't be autistic and aren't autistic at times. But I was thinking back to when I did, I think it was one of the very first postgrad certificates in autism or Asperger's syndrome. I can't remember what it's called. I just remember a lot of older white men, I'm sorry to put it like that if that's offensive to anybody, showing a lot of pictures of brains and showing what they considered evidence of difference. And yet there were other stories around about how brains change, that brains can change according to experience, and yet some aspects of brains cannot. But there was very little. It was all, and what I think a lot of people don't realize, and which is why conversations like this are so important, is that most of the millions of pounds going into research are still trying to find cause and cure, and therefore eradication. So if all or most of the research is going into finding the cause of autism in order to avoid autistic people being born, then actually the history of the psycho element of our professions is related to eugenics. That's going on. And at some point, somebody will think they've discovered the cause of autism and try and effect that into some kind of policy. Whereas I think what's happened is, particularly maybe with the internet, is that autistic people are meeting each other and going, hang on a minute, let's talk about this another way. I have a voice, I have life experience to draw on. I'm an expert by experience, or however people want to describe themselves. And then there's a very different conversation going on. So a lot of people will say, don't say I'm somebody with autism. I want to say I'm an autistic person. What other variations are you noticing in terms of language, Mary, and in terms of how people are getting together and creating a sense of community, and community as activism?
I'm not so sure about just language, but I think what you've touched on is that real shift, isn't it, in the focus of research and the researchers and the researched as well. As you say, it used to be very much an aboutness thing, very quite first order, people researching autistic people. I think it was Pelicano who looked at the kind of the themes of the research, and as you say, the large percentage was on kind of prevention and cure. With very little being about improving the lives and the lived experience of autistic people. But there's beginning to be more of a shift. There's beginning to be more autistic-led research with a respect for the lives of the people that are being researched as well. So people aren't sort of treated like lab rats in experiments as well. And that shift towards improving life experience. The other kind of shift in the impact of research is a lot of research around diagnosis was diagnosis of boys. So a lot of the research tools are kind of informed by working with boys, assessing boys, diagnosing boys, and that's why we've seen so many girls slipping through the net as people's understanding of lived autism as well as observed autism has started to improve. We're kind of getting better with that. But I think somebody described a research tool that will identify girls as almost being searched like as if it's the Holy Grail. So people are still kind of looking for something that that will work. I suppose I was thinking about when Canna first named autism. So he saw a group of behaviours in a group of children and young people. And he defined that as something markedly unique. He used those terms. And I think one thing we see now is we have hundreds of thousands of children, young people, adults waiting on waiting lists for an autism assessment or diagnosis. So is that markedly unique? Is no longer sort of defining what we see when we talk about autism. And I wrote a bit of data down earlier, but in Southeast England, the predicted figures for children and young people waiting for an autism assessment are going to be in the hundreds of thousands by 2025. And the cost to eradicate the waiting list, so just to reduce the waiting list, will be over £100 million. And that's just the children's weights. That's not the adults' weights as well. And I was just thinking about right back to the early social constructionist writing, so kind of Berger and Luckman. They said that even the unproblematic sector of everyday reality is so only until further notice. And that is until its continuity is interrupted by the appearance of a problem. And I think, Houston, we've got a problem. When we think about autism and autism diagnosis now, I think if we keep doing what we've always done, we'll keep getting what we've always got. And that's dissatisfaction, that's waiting lists, that's, you know, money that needs to be spent elsewhere as well. We absolutely need to get it right. We need autistic people and neurodivergent people to be able to get the right support, to be able to identify, to be able to recognise and celebrate their strengths, as well as, you know, identify their support needs and have accessibility to their support needs. But we also need to be able to provide all the other health services that are necessary out there, because those people will also need to go to the dentist, have podiatry, maybe go to mental health services, and all the money can't go on the diagnosis when there's all those other needs as well. So I think our challenge now is to work with autism and autistic people, to work with neurodivergence in a way that enables us to do something differently, that improves quality of life, improves identity, but that doesn't depend on an archaic system now of having to have 2 or 3 very experienced professionals with one child for over 3 hours to start that journey. We need to start doing things differently. And I think as social constructionists, I think we have a part to play in that, because it's about changing narratives, and that's our business, isn't it? It's about working with narratives and stories and meaning. So, you know, what can we start to do differently that are, as I said, is very respectful still of people's lived experience as well?
These are very important things, because often systemic and other mental health practitioners who are not psychologists or psychiatrists, i.e. not qualified to diagnose, are the second-class citizens in the world of autism. And as though autism somehow belongs in psychiatry or psychology, they own it because they can diagnose it or not, or it belongs in some kind of social care and support. And so as systemic or social constructionist practitioners, we can make up our role, but we have to be clear about, we have to be confident about what it is we think we can offer. This week I saw something, just to sort of connect back to what you were saying about the need. I saw something in one of the social media things, and it said, when we hear people say, oh, these days, everybody seems to have something. Everybody says they're neurodivergent or autistic or got ADHD. What we should be saying is, how come this group, such a large group of people, have been so neglected for so long, so under-resourced? And then that repositions us in a way, as maybe what Vicky Reynolds might say is a fluid and imperfect ally. Somebody who's willing to get alongside and listen. The other thing that really worries me is the amount now that professionals are gatekeepers to resources. So, for example, and I put a link in the chat to Murmurations. There was a special issue of Murmurations. That's the link at 2020. 28, there was a special issue of Murmurations from the Autism and Intersectionality Conference. And the first paper, and you can find also on the Systemic Practice YouTube channel, you can see a video if you don't want to read a paper, of Felix Moore, a young man, a young trans man, challenging the authorities. He actually challenged some of the psychoanalytic practitioners within the Tavistock Clinic, but he came to our conference and gave one of the best talks I've ever heard, in which he described how important it is for our autistic people who, for example, are trans, to do their best to mask their autism when asking for help around something else, because they won't get help around something else if their autism is clocked, because it's considered a comorbidity. And in that context would mean this person is less likely to be capable of making a good decision around their gender identity than somebody who is not autistic.
Mm.
So
Yeah,
please do look at Felix's, and I'll put the YouTube thing in the whatnot.
And I think that kind of diagnostic overshadowing occurs a lot, doesn't it? There's lots of people talk about their experience of one thing not being seen or identified because of another thing. And I think within autism, that particularly seems to happen quite a lot from people I've spoken to. In physical health conditions, as well as identity or other emotional conditions as well. So it's what people see, isn't it? I think when I talked to the mothers in my research, that was one of their fears, was that people would see the autism before they saw their daughters, and even before meeting their daughters, they would have preconceived ideas about them that were negative. And the mothers themselves, before they started on the journey for their daughter's diagnosis, their stories of autism were quite negative. One mother even used the word nasty. I think she said, "Oh, that's nasty." That was how she'd picked up, what autism was. Stories about boys, stories about rocking in corners, all these kind of stories that, again, may describe some people, and again, shouldn't be seen as negative, but the mothers saw that and perceived it that way. So when their daughters did get a diagnosis, they were aware that other people would have those narratives and other people would hold those stereotypes. And even when their stories and their experience changed and they became more celebratory about their daughter's strengths and their, uniqueness, and even sort of describing their autism as a superpower, they were still aware that other people wouldn't have been on that journey with them, and they would still be holding those negative stereotypes that they had at the beginning.
Let's just look in the chat for a minute and see what people are saying. Is that all right?
Yeah, of course.
So Tracy's saying we need some blue sky thinking about the diagnosis process, the ownership of this process, the pathologizing of this process. Love the idea of peer-supported diagnosis, and following the lead of the autistic community of self-diagnosis, current methods, ADOS, etc., are sledgehammers to crack nuts, just not up to the task. Mary, do you want to add anything to that?
So I'm distracted by the other comment that's just it's gone after it.
Well, maybe other people in the group might have things to say in relation to that.
Yeah, which is about the thoughts on the TikTok crowd who self-diagnosed. And I think that's the difficulty, is we've got, if we validate and enable self-diagnosis, does that then reduce the strength of it? Because people say, well, everybody's a bit this, everybody's a bit that. And I think that what we see on TikTok is there'll be something about ADHD and then everyone will have it. And that's the kind of story that goes with it, isn't it? So I suppose every action has potential consequences or unintended consequences, doesn't it? So if you open something out, what does that mean, and what does that lead to, I suppose?
One of the things that I think autism creates and the process of diagnosis creates is a sort of notion that there's a line. You've just crossed the line. You crossed the line by a mile. So there's a sort of binary there. And although people talk about spectrum, it's still a line, and it's a mono line. It's a single line. And Fran Orbistondo Cano and I wrote a paper called, I'm just trying to remember what it was called, From Autism Spectrum to Multispectral Living, because we were trying to talk about context, about when people feel or experience autism more or less. What is it about the social context? When is a social disorder, which autism is often understood as being, when is that to do with the social context being disabling, as opposed to the person having a disability, as it were, within them? How come they're enabled, somebody's feeling more able, more confident, more communicative, more whatever it is, in some situations than in others, or at some times of day than in other times of day? So we try to kind of think more about many spectra in play, and thinking also about the problem of autism is that it foregrounds a particular set of characteristics, a cluster of characteristics about a person. But actually, if you're a young Black autistic man in some cities, or most cities in the UK, and probably in the United States and maybe other countries that are predominantly white and white supremacist one way or another, the risk is primarily about being Black, and the autism adds to that risk, because you're not necessarily going to be able to understand the context or calm yourself enough, or have the support, rather, is maybe a better way of putting it, to understand what's going on when the police stop you for behaving what they might consider erratically and try and restrain you, and all that that can lead to. There's been some interesting work going on in virtual reality to try and train young people to understand when they are stopped, Black young people, when they're stopped by the police, not to run, and how to, because of course in a moment of anxiety, we all know what this feels. In some situations, you cannot hear what the other person's telling you. You're just too anxious. You just see their mouths moving if you're in a state of shock or whatever. For a lot of autistic people, that's going to be multiplied, and people can feel very misunderstood, cornered, paralyzed, panicked, trapped, and behave in exactly the way that's going to put them at risk. And I remember, Fran, when we looked at these videos to train young people how to behave with the police coming up to them and saying, "Stop, what are you doing? Who are you?" And you just hear this muffled noise in the video of the police talking. Fran got quite annoyed, because he was saying, it's the police that need to be trained, not the young people trained to adapt to the police.
Absolutely.
So,
Actually,
yeah.
you've reminded me of a comment a mother made. We were talking about the circle of friends that her school had recommended for her daughter. And she said, and I'm going to swear now, sorry, but I'm quoting. She said that the work needed to be around teaching other children not to be little shits, not teaching her daughter how to fit in. So similar kind of position, really. It's trying to get people to act outside of who they are, rather than looking at how services and situations can adapt in a way that's inclusive and understanding, isn't it?
And I remember Ingrid Vlam's research saying, taking issue with the reasonable adjustments clause in employment law, saying these are not exceptions that need to be made for autistic people, but they are quality of life issues that need to be introduced into the workplace for all people.
Yeah.
Better lighting, different sound environments, whatever it is, all manner of things. And when we did that presentation on neurodiverse conferencing, what we discovered is that everything we were doing or trying to do or recommended was just good conference practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's that shift, isn't it, to anticipatory adjustments instead of reasonable adjustments, because with reasonable adjustments, you have to ask, you know, you have to go and say, please, can I have? Whereas anticipatory adjustments, like you say, that helps everybody anyway, not just one person who's singled out as needing it.
Glenn's put something in. I'm interested in an idea about context sensitivity. And what Gail was implying, we can all position or act in ways that others may consider connect with autistic patterns. Glenn, do you want to unmute yourself and just say a bit about that?
Yeah, there we go. I just followed an autistic pattern. I froze, perhaps, I don't know. I don't want to denigrate anyone at all, but what I was thinking about is that there are contexts in which I have friends and my wife who would suggest that I have an autistic pattern. I don't identify as having autism at all. I'm reasonably comfortable in social situations, and although I do know that if I've got a bone, sometimes I won't let it go, and I will keep chewing on it until I don't stop. Now, whether or not that is to do with me and a diagnosis and my identity, but it does have a sort of dependence upon the context in which I'm in. And I meet with and work with people who do identify as autistic, and that there are times and moments when there's no evidence of anything, like they struggle, and there are times when there are acute moments when they do struggle, and I'm interested in the fluidity of how we connect with our contexts. And there are people that I work with who have specific sensitivities to touch or sight or sound that can get rated in certain contexts. I don't know if I've explained myself enough, but it's for me, it's the notion of social constructionism and how people find themselves in a context that generates certain actions and patterns.
I was just thinking about what you were saying about people in the same person in different contexts as well. And Gail quoted that, you know, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person earlier, which wasn't me. But what was me was if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person on one particular day. And I think people do change in it. I think autistic people, but people in general, we can be like chameleons. And there's a level of masking that you'll have. So some people will work very hard to fit in, but then it's almost like that effort to fit in has been used up. I'm sure you've probably heard of spoon theory. So people have got so many spoons that they can use throughout the day. And I think people will end up using up all their spoons, and they can no longer kind of work to mask or hide or fit in. Or they'll be in environments that are more suited to them, and the context allow them to be more comfortable or fit in and are more enabling for them. I don't know that I'm answering your question, really. I think I'm rambling a bit, Glenn, sorry. But it's so much is about context, isn't it, and culture. I mean, even when we think about the ADOS, so the assessment diagnostic tools that are used around autism, you have a cutoff, like Gail was saying, there's a cutoff point between, you know, if it's a 9, it indicates autism. If it's a 7, it doesn't. So, you know, we get this kind of borderline conversations. But most of the things on the ADOS can score 1 or 2, but eye contact will automatically score a 2. So unusual eye contact or, you know, avoiding eye contact, you immediately get a 2. But there are cultures where eye contact is seen as rude and you wouldn't hold eye contact with somebody because it would be seen as disrespectful. So would that person automatically score a 2 on an ADOS for a diagnosis? And thinking about Gail's example of a black male being stopped by the police, if you're a black male who's been taught, who's autistic, who's been taught you should have eye contact, but then because you've been taught to have eye contact, your eye contact is quite threatening because you're kind of staring because you're working hard to use eye contact when it's not natural to you. The interpretation of that effort to engage will potentially be seen as a sign of being more threatening. So the context definitely shifts things all the time, doesn't it, in terms of ability to act and an ability to be seen to act in different ways, really.
Are there other people who want to jump in? Either just unmute yourself and say something or put something in the chat.
Yeah, because we've got 10 minutes left. It would be good to hear from some other people, wouldn't it, Gail? I'm wondering if we could be unpinned and have the whole screen up.
Is Kate Meredith has said, is language still used around the social model of disability? Kate, do you want to say, unmute yourself and say something? Oh, we can't hear you for some reason. Oh, okay. Sorry, for some reason we can't hear you. Well, I can't hear you anyway.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me now at all?
Yes.
All right, lovely. I'm a systemic psychotherapist, and I used to work as a speech and language therapist, and I used to work with people who had had strokes and brain injuries. And a lot of our training was around the social model of disability, and it's not really something that I've heard much of for a while, but I just wondered whether or not, when we're thinking about language, that was something that in my training a long time ago, I was thinking about the barriers in society. And for example, when a communication disorder, as it was called, was not present, when aphasia was not present, was when actually society was doing really, really well, and those barriers weren't in place. And I wondered how that fits in the current kind of language processes around autism and neurodiversity, and whether or not it's got a place, or if the language has moved much further on than that.
I actually don't have I'm not sure. I mean, I think it does have a place. But potentially it's kind of developed as well. I think everything's thinking about the sort of disability theory when I looked at autism in my thesis, and there's lots of kind of synergy and connection, really. Don't know, Gail, what do you think?
I was thinking there's a revolution going on around the language. Even the stuff on TikTok, votes on who likes chicken nuggets or whatever it was, is part of playing with the language. It's part of a shift in power, a reclaiming. And I think a lot of things are up for grabs now. Who's making the theory? What policies come into play? I'm not familiar enough with the social model of disability to actually have a better response than that, Kate. So you might be having some further thoughts, or other people might be. The other thing, just to sort of add in terms of that, the concept of social disorder is perhaps one that's replaced the concept of disability. And especially, I think, for a lot of young people who are watching anime, Japanese anime, there's a lot of highlighting in those movies and in manga around social communication, social coordination struggles. So there's a sort of normalizing that's going on and creeping into younger age groups as well. And autism, I think, is maybe, another generation's professional language.
Don't know if anyone else has got any thoughts or questions or comments they want to share. Whether the conversation we've been having connects or disconnects.
Yeah, I was wondering if anybody disagrees with anything that, you know, we've been saying, or something that surprises you or missed out. There's some good links in the chat. Sorry.
I found the conversation very interesting, but I suppose I'm taken with the idea when you're talking about numbers and all the vast that we've missed over the years, the experience of people who are autistic, or are there more people who are seeing life in this particular way or experience life in this particular way? Did we miss them all these years? Or were they there?
It's a good question, isn't it? And I think there's lots of different discussions about whether people have been missed or misdiagnosed or misunderstood, or if it is about those changing boundaries and what would have been once defined as, or, you know, not autistic is now defined as autistic, or whether it's you know, our cultural practices and you know, the way life is now that makes us identify autism more than we did before. There's so many theories, and they're kind of multiple, and they keep increasing really in terms of, you know, why the numbers really. Is it more understanding, or is it more autism, or is it both?
Do you have an opinion on it?
I'm interested in the question. I'm interested in numbers questions, you know, because there's something about context. You could ask something similar about other population groups to some degree. Are there more permissions for people to reveal themselves? Or is there more kind of cause of something or the other? But I guess once we start asking these questions, and they are important and interesting questions to ask, but maybe as stepping stones, because if we think we have a problem because there's more people struggling, for example, if that's a particular punctuation, then the question is, have we done something wrong as a society that's created this problem group of people? If we say people are, we don't know why there are more people like this. We don't know what makes people autistic. I suppose I come from an era as a lesbian of people often having asked, why are people gay? What makes people gay? And there's a dangerous element to that question, because if we knew, then probably the sort of dominant eugenic-oriented right would make some alternative plans to avoid a growth in any particular group of people. So the why question, whether it's biological or genetic or social or political or whatever, I think is a very tricky question. And the same goes for people who are autistic, because autism isn't necessarily a problem, but it might be that people are able to identify sooner or later some particular kinds of struggles they have in this world. The world is very weird. Sometimes I think a lot of autistic people are much more able to articulate what their struggles are, and that it's the neurotypical people who are very busy masking. And
I would say that our culture is in such a fractious state that, you know, there are a lot of people that maybe, you know, autism is almost a protest, and then sometimes people who are quite rightly saying, you know, this is not okay, but they're looking for some kind of sense of belonging. and that it's more to do with that than any particular neurobiological state?
So there are some people who would say autism's a choice, and others would say it's not a choice, it's a thing. It's something that they don't have choice about. Some people would say it's an identity politics thing. Again, a sort of choice, a community, a need to belong. And other people would say, I only felt normal when I found others like me. So there's it's a very controversial thing. I suppose the main thing is, fortunately, there are many more texts written by autistic people, more films, more texts, more policies. And I think that's the way to go, because I found for myself, some of my questions are intuitively answered somehow. I don't know what I mean by that. When I listen to or am alongside people who define as neurodiverse.
Mary and Gail, this has been really a provocative and very useful conversation. And I'm aware that we have about 1 minute left. And so I just wanted to ask if there was a burning question or comment that someone wanted to make, or if Mary or Gail, you want to say some closing words.
My closing words would be, this is a moment in time and we have no idea what's coming next.
I agree. I think we're on the edge of a change.
And please come to the next Systemic Autism Conference. Just keep looking at systemicautism.com.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you for this conversation, very rich. Thank you to all of you for being here, for your interesting comments and questions. And this will be posted soon. Can't tell you exactly when, but the recording will be on the Taos Institute Commons, so you can relive it. Thank you all.
Thank you all for.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. And nice to see Claudia in the background there as well, because Claudia was one of the original presenters at a systemic autism group at Bedfordshire.
Mm.
Lovely to see you too.
Thank you, Claudia.
Sorry, I'm on my phone and I don't know why the camera is not working.
Oh,
But yeah,
don't worry.
it's
And
lovely sort of to see you.
oh, that's nice. That's nice.
Oh, I'll try sort of to go to the conference. I just need to know when it is. And
Yes, we
yeah,
don't know when it is yet either.
yeah, okay.
Okay. Thank you, Sheila, for hosting.
I saved the chat,
Oh, great.
so I can send that to you.
Mm.
If it worked that I saved it, I think it did. I think I did that little technological thing properly. So thanks a lot. That was really nice. It was very thought-provoking.
Thank you. Well, thanks for giving us the space to do it. It was great.
Yeah. Do more. I mean, we are so interested in having, these conversations just an hour, and it's so, you see how people are interested. So
Yeah,
if you have other ideas, we would love to have you do more of this.
we will.
Super.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good evening, won't you?
And Mary, we'll catch up and have a follow-up conversation, at least on WhatsApp.
Absolutely.